Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing headaches. Okay, so we're taking a little bit of a detour from discussing the pathophysiology of tension-type headaches to discuss a little bit of background knowledge. And at the moment, that background knowledge that we're going over is the anatomy of the trigeminal nerve. So I thought it was better to structure the video like this rather than doing all the background at the start. The reason I didn't want to begin the video by going over all the background knowledge was because there's so much background knowledge that I'm going to go over for this video, so much background anatomy, and therefore we'd have been going through that for ages before we ever actually saw an example of a headache. So I thought it was better to begin by talking about a headache and then do the background when we actually want to try and explain the pathophysiology of that first type of headache. So that's the way I've done it. We're now taking this detour to do some of the background knowledge that we need for understanding headaches, now that I've ensnared you by showing you an example of a headache. Okay, so we're currently discussing, as I say, the anatomy of the trigeminal nerve. We've got a lot more background to do other than just the anatomy of the trigeminal nerve, but that's where we are currently. And we've seen that the trigeminal nerve after the trigeminal ganglion is going to split into these three divisions: the ophthalmic nerve, the maxillary nerve, and the mandibular nerve. We've so far studied the branches of the ophthalmic nerve. We have the maxillary nerve and the mandibular nerve still to do. So that's what we're going to attempt to do in this video. So 5B is obviously where to go next, so we're going to do the maxillary nerve. So the maxillary nerve is this second one here, in between the ophthalmic and the mandibular, and it's going to exit the middle cranial fossa as well, just like the ophthalmic did. And it's going to exit the middle cranial fossa by going through a hole in the base of the middle cranial fossa skull bone that is called the foramen rotundum. So let me try and show this in pink here. So what I'm now highlighting in pink here, this is representing this hole in the base of the middle cranial fossa called foramen, and then it's rotundum. Rotundum. Okay, so this is a hole in the base of the skull. It's in this sort of position. You know, if you do look at the cranial cavity, just like I've shown you, you will see the foramen rotundum in about these positions here, and it's the hole through which the maxillary nerve goes. So we've now got a complicated story to tell. Where on earth does it come out? It would be so easy if it came out in the orbital cavity. Unfortunately, it doesn't come out in the orbital cavity. It comes out in a ghastly anatomically difficult site called the pterygopalatine fossa. So I'm now going to be given the difficult task of explaining to you the anatomy of this fossa called the pterygopalatine fossa. None of the pictures that I have so far drawn show this fossa yet, so we're going to have to draw a new picture to be able to show where this thing is. So this is a little space, it's a fossa, that comes off the infratemporal fossa. So the best picture I've got for so far for trying to explain this is this picture where we're looking at the skull from the side. So we know where the infratemporal fossa is. It's behind the zygomatic arch. It's this space through which the tendon of the temporalis muscle moves to attach to the coronoid process of the mandible. Now, the pterygopalatine fossa is off from the infratemporal fossa. So if I was a little man standing behind the zygomatic arch here in the infratemporal fossa, I could then choose to go into this thing called the pterygopalatine fossa. It's a little space that's up in this sort of region, just underneath the orbital cavity, and the foramen rotundum behind comes and opens out into this space called the pterygopalatine fossa. And indeed, what will happen, we'll see, is that most of the nerves go, in fact, the maxillary nerve, the branches of it are going to go into the orbital cavity through the inferior orbital fissure that we'll draw on later on, which opens up into the pterygopalatine fossa. So, let's try and draw a picture then of the pterygopalatine fossa. So what I need to do is redraw this picture out. I'm not going to draw the whole thing, I'm just going to draw this sort of bit. And I want to take away the zygomatic arch. I want to imagine cutting here, and then taking that section of bone of the zygomatic arch out so that we can see the infratemporal fossa behind. So, summon the white pen back again. So, let's draw a picture here of this. So as I say, I'm not going to draw the full thing, I'm just going to draw a bit of it zoomed in on. So here is, again, the forehead, here is the nasal bone, This is then the entrance to the nasal cavity, and then we come down here to where we'll have the teeth, but I'll just abandon that bit for a moment now. Let's put on the orbital cavity next. That'll show us what we're looking at. So here, this is the orbital cavity, this semicircle here, and I'll just colour it in. So that's where the eyeball, the left eyeball, would be. Now let's put on the zygomatic bone. So here is the zygomatic bone, and then we'll have the beginning of the zygomatic arch here, but we're now imagining that we've cut this up. So here is the cut surface of the zygomatic arch here, and here is the remainder of it attaching down there. Right, so we now want to see what would we see behind the zygomatic arch now that we've cut it open. So what we will see is the infratemporal fossa. So how does the bone actually behave behind here? Well, it sort of loops over in this way, like so. So this is the skull, this is the base of the skull, this is the base of the skull. You'd have the middle cranial fossa here, if we could chisel through the bone here. Then over here we're going to have the styloid process, the external auditory meatus, and the mastoid process, so I'll put those on. So here's the styloid process. You'll then have where the external acoustic meatus is, or the external auditory meatus, and here is the maxillary process. So let me just mark these on. So here is the external acoustic meatus, the entrance to the external ear canal, which is located within the petrous portion of the temporal bone. So what we are seeing here is actually the temporal bone. The styloid process and the mastoid process, they are parts of the temporal bone in this region, and here's the external acoustic meatus. So let's now draw on the zygomatic process of the temporal bone that's cut open. So here we have it, and again we'll have the cut surface here, like so. And then, of course, we'll need the place where the temporomandibular joint is, which is there, and it goes like this. So this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. This is where we've cut it open so that we can see the infratemporal fossa here. This is where the the head of the mandible would articulate to form the temporomandibular joint. Alright, so this picture is going reasonably well. Let's hope I don't ruin it now. So we're going to draw on the teeth, which is destined to ruin the picture. So let's do this down here. I think I'll extend it a little bit further downwards. And here, this can be the teeth. And then the rest of the maxillary bone can come up like this. Okay, and I'll mark on the teeth here. So these are the teeth here, not looking particularly brilliant. But they get the message across. Okay, so it's all going very well, in fact. This is the maxillary bone here, all maxillary bone. This is zygomatic bone. And now I'm going to draw on something very, very important for us to see here, which is the lateral pterygoid plate, which is part of the sphenoid bone. So there's an extension here coming like this. And even like this, my picture isn't actually brilliantly showing the pterygopalatine fossa, so I might try and extend a few things backwards a bit. I'm going to take this out, because otherwise we're not going to actually see the pterygopalatine fossa. I also want to... it's not going to let me. Wait, bear with me a second. I'm going to rub over in black. By getting a black pen, I can actually erase without actually needing the eraser function. And I'll just make it thicker so that we can do it a little bit quicker. So I'm going to extend this backwards because the way I've drawn it isn't perfect for actually showing the pterygopalatine fossa, and it's not quite correct because the picture I've attempted to draw you here with the zygomatic arch cut open like this should show the pterygopalatine fossa. So I'm going to bring the maxillary bone back further like this, and that looks better because this should not connect up to this. This bit of bone here is in a different plane to the maxillary bone. The maxillary bone that's coming up and joining to the bottom of the skull here is behind this bit of bone, which is the side of the skull here, the side of the infratemporal fossa. So this is the side of the infratemporal fossa, and this, of course, up here is the temporal fossa, whereas the maxillary bone is connecting up to a part of the base of the skull that's behind that. So they're in different planes, whereas the way I'd drawn it, it looked as though this was continuous with this. And this is going to be much better because this is actually going to successfully show the pterygopalatine fossa. So let me just add on a few more teeth. So here we go, here are a few more teeth. And now let me put on the lateral pterygoid plate of the sphenoid bone, which comes up like this. Okay, so I think this has everything I could possibly want to explain where the pterygopalatine fossa actually is. And in fact, I'm going to have to modify the picture because it doesn't show the pterygopalatine fossa. It's incorrect at the moment, but let me put some annotations on firstly. So, key things that we've learned from this picture is the name of this plate, or key things we've hopefully revised from this picture is the lateral pterygoid plate. So this articulates with the back of the maxilla here that is forming the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Remember, in the middle of the maxilla you have the nasal cavity, and of course you have a left nasal cavity and a right nasal cavity separated by a nasal septum running through them. The walls, the lateral walls of both nasal cavities are very, very thick pieces of bone. And at the back here, the maxilla, which forms the lateral part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, is becoming continuous with this pterygoid plate. And in fact, there's two pterygoid plates on each side, a lateral pterygoid plate and then a medial pterygoid plate that we can't see that's just medial to this. They're hanging down from a bone that makes up the skull that's in the center here, called the sphenoid bone. It makes up, for instance, part of the floor of the anterior cranial fossa, and it makes up the pituitary fossa. All of those bits of bone, they are the sphenoid bone, and you've got these bits hanging down from it here, which are the pterygoid plates. We can only see the lateral pterygoid plate at the moment, so this is the lateral pterygoid plate that I've drawn on there. So, the pterygopalatine fossa, obviously the reason it's called pterygopalatine fossa is that it's close to the pterygoid plates. The lateral pterygoid plate has the medial pterygoid plate just medial to it. So if I stripped away the lateral pterygoid plate, you'd see another one just pretty much identical to it, which is the medial pterygoid plate that's on that same wall of the left nasal cavity. And on the right side, again, you have a lateral and a medial pterygoid plate, and they're both making up part of the wall, the lateral wall of the nasal cavity on their respective sides. So now let me change the picture so that we can actually show the pterygopalatine fossa. So I need to again rub something out by using my black pen trick, so I need to get all of this bit here gone. So in that space that I've now erased, that is where the pterygopalatine fossa is going to be. So there is, in fact, a little cavity here between the top of the lateral pterygoid plate and the maxillary bone here, which is called the pterygopalatine fossa. So there's a little hole here. Remember, this is where it's really important to understand. I'll bring you back to this picture here. The walls, the lateral walls of these nasal cavities are very, very thick. There's a lot of bone there, and you can have a little cavity in that bone, and that is where this pterygopalatine fossa is. It's just underneath the orbital cavity in this bone that we think makes up the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Okay, so that's where this fossa is. Why is it called pterygopalatine? Palatine, where does the palatine come from? Well, of course, the palatine bone is another bone in the skull, and it makes up part of the wall of the lateral wall of the nasal cavities towards the back. So I'll try and show this. So these are the maxillary bones. This is the right maxillary bone, this is the left maxillary bone. They join together in the midline and form the maxilla. Okay, they make up most of the bone that is the lateral walls of the nasal cavity. However, as you get towards the back of the lateral walls of the nasal cavity, they only make up the lateral part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, and medially, the medial portions of the lateral wall is made up instead by a palatine bone, which is right at the back, which also makes up the posterior portions of the hard palate at the back. So remember, if you were a little man going into the oral cavity and you looked up, there is a hard palate. You can't stick your finger up into your nasal cavity, there's bone there, okay? At the front, that's made up by the maxillary bones, but as you get further back, that roof is made up by the palatine bones, and the palatine bones aren't just a square of bone, instead they also have a bit that runs upwards that makes up the medial part, like so, of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. So I might just try and show the sort of shape of the palatine bones. So there's one, there's another one, and they have a bit like this going up, so they have this sort of shape. So this is meant to represent the plate that makes up the hard palate at the back of the hard palate, and this is the bit that goes up, making up the medial part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavities on both sides, whereas the lateral part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity at the back is still made up by maxillary bone. I should stress that the palatine bones are right at the back, they're not at the front. But of course, where we are looking, this is right at the back. So this is still maxillary bone, what I'm highlighting here. But if I chiseled through here into the medial part of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, so I'm still in bone, I haven't got into the nasal cavity. I don't want you to chisel so far that you get into nasal cavity. I just want you to chisel a bit through the bone. You then hit palatine bone here. You wouldn't hit palatine bone if you chisel through here, for instance. It would all be maxillary bone. If you chisel through here, of course, you go through the maxillary sinus, which we're going to learn about in just a moment. So, I hope now I have sort of justified the name of this fossa. I hope you are kind of familiar with where it actually is. You need to take away the zygomatic arch and go into this little crevice here. This is this bad red thing called the pterygopalatine fossa. And up here, there is going to be foramen rotundum coming out, and that's where the maxillary nerve is going to come. So let me just show this here in yellow. So here comes the maxillary nerve, 5B, into the pterygopalatine fossa. Right, so we now want to see the branches of the maxillary nerve. So there are two major branches that the maxillary nerve is going to split into, and those are the zygomatic nerve and the infraorbital nerve. So let me show these. Now, I should be careful here. They're not going to it's not going to divide into two, and then you're going to have the zygomatic nerve and the infraorbital nerve. It's more complicated than that. It's going to give off the zygomatic nerve. It will continue on and still be called the maxillary nerve, and then the maxillary nerve will become the infraorbital nerve when it enters the infraorbital groove and then the infraorbital canal and comes out of the infraorbital foramen. So the first branch of the maxillary nerve, therefore, is actually going to be the zygomatic nerve. So I'll show this like so. And then it continues on. So this is meant to represent it continuing on. This is its first branch here, which is the zygomatic nerve. So, what is the zygomatic nerve going to do? The zygomatic nerve is going to go into the orbital cavity first. And this is really the only place these things can go, because I haven't told you something that I need to now add on to this picture, which is that the pterygopalatine fossa is actually just underneath the orbital cavity, and it's in fact connected with the orbital cavity by the inferior orbital fissure. So let me mark on in, actually I'll get a new picture of it, or actually I can try and put it in that picture. So let's get another colour here, let's get purple. So we talked about the superior orbital fissure in the previous video when we were discussing the ophthalmic nerve. It's in the posterior wall of the orbital cavity. We're now talking about the inferior orbital fissure, which is in the floor of the orbital cavity. So try and imagine that I'm drawing in the floor of the orbital cavity. It's got this sort of angle. It starts right in the medial posterior corner here, where the superior orbital fissure has an ending here, and then moves laterally and forward like so. So if we were a little man standing in the orbital cavity looking down at the inferior orbital fissure, this is what we would see. So I'll draw this here. So this is the bottom of the orbital cavity. This is the bony bottom of the orbital cavity. We're looking down at the maxillary bone that we're standing on here. And we'll say that we are in the right orbital cavity. This is lateral, this is medial. This, therefore, is what the inferior orbital fissure looks like so. So this is another slit opening in the bone, and this is going to open right into the pterygopalatine fossa. So I'm just going to add it in on this picture as well. So there's the inferior orbital fissure on that side. So I'll just write down its name. We've got superior orbital fissure there, but I will add on here. We have added into the picture the inferior orbital fissure. Okay, so Let me now add it on to my picture of the pterygopalatine fossa over here, or at least try to add it on to my picture here. So remember the angle that it's coming at. It starts in the posterior medial inferior corner over here, and it moves its way laterally and forward. So you can kind of imagine that it's sort of at the same angle that this thing is at. So indeed it does actually open up onto the pterygopalatine fossa, like so. So, if you're in the pterygopalatine fossa, you can go through this inferior orbital fissure into the orbital cavity, and this is exactly what the zygomatic nerve is going to do. It's going to come through the inferior orbital fissure, and it will then be in the lateral portion, lateral inferior portion of the orbital cavity. This nerve then divides into two, and I'm going to try and show this on my picture here. So, here it comes. It's then in the orbital cavity, so we'll imagine that this is the orbital cavity here, and we're imagining it's in the orbital cavity, and it's lateral inferior, running along the lateral inferior border of the orbital cavity here. It's now going to split into two, and those two branches are the zygomaticofacial nerve and the zygomaticotemporal nerve. And these are going to enter into separate little foramina, which is the plural of foramen, in the lateral wall of the orbital cavity that is made up by the zygomatic bone, and they come out in foramina on the surface of the skull. So let me show this. So here firstly, let's just show it splitting into two. So here is it splitting into two. So these two branches are the zygomaticofacial, so zygomaticofacial nerve, and also the zygomaticotemporal nerve. And these are going to enter little holes in the lateral wall of the orbital cavity, which is the portion of the wall of the orbital cavity that is made up by the zygomatic bone. Remember, this is the zygomatic bone here. It makes up part of the wall of the orbital cavity, this lateral inferior wall of the orbital cavity, and it has two little holes for these two nerves to go in, and they're going to come out of this bone on the surface. And let's have zygomaticofacial nerve, so we'll have this as the zygomaticofacial one, and we'll have this as the zygomaticotemporal one. So this is going to come out in a foramen that is in this kind of position. In fact, I should do this in a different colour. So we'll go in for green here. So in green, this is the foramen that the zygomaticofacial nerve is going to come out, and this is known as the zygomaticofacial foramen, and it's on the surface of the zygomatic bone, and therefore this nerve is going to come out on the surface of the cheeks. And the zygomaticotemporal bone is the zygomaticotemporal nerve. It's going to go through a hole in the zygomatic bone that is in the wall of the orbital cavity, and it's going to come out of a foramen called the zygomaticotemporal foramen, which is going to face in to the infratemporal fossa. So this is the this can represent the zygomaticotemporal foramen over there. So just drawing this, they will tunnel through the bone in these special little channels that are in the bone for them, and they will come out of these foramina. So here is each of them coming out of their respective foramina. So just to summarise what we've seen so far, the first branch that the maxillary nerve gives off is this zygomatic nerve, which goes through, once it's got into the pterygopalatine fossa, the first branch that the maxillary nerve gives off is this zygomatic nerve, which goes through the inferior orbital fissure into the orbital cavity. There it splits into two. It gives off the zygomaticofacial nerve and the zygomaticotemporal nerve. Both of these go through little holes that are in the lateral wall of the orbital cavity, and down here, basically, the wall of the orbital cavity that is made up by the zygomatic bone. They then go through the zygomatic bone in these special canals for them and come out in their respective foramens on the surface of the zygomatic bone. Now, the zygomaticofacial one comes out on the surface of the face. It comes out right where the cheekbones are, whereas the zygomaticotemporal one comes out in the infratemporal fossa here through the zygomaticotemporal foramen. So what are these going to innervate? Well, remember, they're going to carry the peripheral processes of pseudo-unipolar primary sensory afferents, and they're going to just innervate with sensory innervation the areas that they've reached. So this is going to cover the cheek, the zygomaticofacial nerve here. The zygomaticotemporal nerve is going to cover part of the temporal region here. So, for instance, it might cover part of the temporalis muscle, which is, of course, in the temporal fossa here. So it's going to cover things in that sort of region. So overall, we're getting the message that in this sort of region, we're going to have sensory innervation carried by the maxillary nerve. Whereas, remember, in the eye and the forehead and the top of the scalp, that was the domain of the ophthalmic nerve. So let's continue on with the anatomy of the maxillary nerve. We want to follow it further. So we've seen its first branch. What's going to happen to the rest of the maxillary nerve now? Well, it's going to go through the inferior orbital the inferior orbital fissure as well, and it's going to go into something called the infraorbital groove. However, before it does that, it's going to give another important branch that I need to mention, which is the posterior superior alveolar nerve. Now, this is something that I remember being very confused about when I first learnt about the nerves that innervate the face. Alveolar nerve, this sounds like something that should be in the lungs, but the alveoli also means the teeth. So these nerves are going to innervate the teeth. Whenever you hear about alveolar nerves, they're going to innervate the teeth. So let's put on the next branch. So this posterior superior alveolar nerve, it's going to branch off the maxillary nerve before the maxillary nerve goes through the inferior orbital fissure. So let me show it here. So here it comes. It's going to come out of the pterygopalatine fossa onto the surface of the maxillary bone, like so, and then it's going to go into a foramen that's in the lateral surface of the maxillary bone in this sort of position called the alveolar foramen. So let's just write down some of the big names that we've had here. And do allow me to get rid of this green dot that's going to annoy me otherwise. Go away. Right, so firstly, the name of this nerve. So we're going to see two other superior alveolar nerves, and when we come on to the anatomy of the mandibular nerve, we're going to see the inferior alveolar nerve as well. This one that we've got so far is the posterior superior alveolar nerve. So it's the one at the back. We're also going to have a middle and anterior superior alveolar nerve. So this is the posterior, and it's also superior because it's going to innervate the top row of teeth rather than the bottom row of teeth. Alveolar is to do with the teeth, so posterior, superior, alveolar, and then of course I can use my abbreviation for nerve, N. So, it comes out of the pterygopalatine fossa over the lateral surface of the maxillary bone, and we can see it. This is, the real picture. This is what it would look like. If you've got the zygomatic arch removed there, you would see it here, coursing along the surface of the maxillary bone here, and then it enters a foramen down here in the maxillary bone, which is called the alveolar foramen. So that hole as it's going through there is called the alveolar foramen. So what is this nerve going to do? Well, it's going to provide innervation to the superior row of teeth. Now, we're going to see that there are two other nerves, the anterior superior alveolar nerve and the middle superior alveolar nerve, that are also going to innervate the superior row of teeth. I do not know exactly what the domain of the posterior superior alveolar nerve is. I don't know if it just innervates the three back teeth or whether, I don't know how many of the teeth it innervates, which teeth precisely it innervates. Together, the three superior alveolar nerves on each side will innervate the superior row of teeth and will, convey sensory information from those teeth. I don't know precisely what the domains of the different components are. Right, so that's the next branch of the maxillary nerve, the posterior superior alveolar nerve. Now that we've discussed that, we can do the main proper bit. What's now going to happen is the whole of the remainder of the maxillary nerve is going to go through the inferior orbital fissure, so I'll try and show this here. So it goes through the inferior orbital fissure, and it's going to end up in the orbital cavity. Once it's in the orbital cavity, it's going to go through something called the infraorbital groove. So, for this, it's probably best to go back to this picture here. So remember what this picture is. It's the floor of the orbital cavity on the right-hand side. We have our nice inferior orbital fissure here. So let's now put on here what is called the infraorbital groove. And this is a very real, very seeable groove in the floor of the orbital cavity. If you do have a model skull, or if next time you see a model skull in medical school, have a look at the orbital cavity and you will see this groove in the floor of the orbital cavity. It's as obvious as the inferior orbital fissure. So it is a groove in the bone. So it's not a hole like the inferior orbital fissure. It's not going completely through the bone, but it's just like a little groove in it. So a little channel, if you like, coming off the inferior orbital fissure. But there is a floory bone, there is a bone of floor underneath the bottom of that groove. So what's going to happen is, whoops, give me my pen. Here will come the remainder of the maxillary nerve. It's going to go through that infraorbital groove there, and I'll try and put it also on these pictures here. So I'll put the infraorbital groove, there's the infraorbital groove on that one, and there's the infraorbital groove on that one. So it's going to go through the infraorbital groove, and then right at the end of the infraorbital groove begins the infraorbital canal. So at the end of it, there is a tunnel for the nerve to go into, a tunnel through the maxillary bone that's going to bring it out at the infraorbital foramen, which is underneath the orbits in these positions here. So let me now write down some of these names that I've been using. So we'll do it up here. So what have I been using? We have seen the infraorbital groove, that was in green. And we've also seen the infraorbital foramen and infraorbital canal. So we've got those actually. Whoops, and I've missed out the R. Infraorbital canal. I'm getting fed up of writing infraorbital. I'll just put and foramen. So we've seen lots of infraorbital things. The infraorbital groove is that groove off the inferior orbital fissure. It ends in the opening to the infraorbital canal. The maxillary nerve, now called the infraorbital nerve, so there's another infraorbital, so I'll add that on. Infraorbital canal and foramen and nerve. So once the maxillary nerve enters, I can't remember whether it's when it enters the infraorbital groove or whether it's when it enters the infraorbital canal. I think it's probably when it enters the infraorbital canal. When it enters one of those, at one of these points, it becomes no longer known as the maxillary nerve, but is now known as the infraorbital nerve. I think it will probably be at the entrance to the infraorbital canal. So I think it probably is the case that we would say the maxillary nerve goes through the infraorbital groove, and then once it's gone into the infraorbital canal, we now call it the infraorbital nerve. It goes through that, comes out of this foramen here, the infraorbital foramen, and then it will innervate structures in that portion of the face. So I'll just sort of show it here. So again, it's now going to innervate these portions of the cheek. So we're getting the same message here. The maxillary nerve innervates the cheek, that sort of region. Remember, we had zygomaticofacial over here on the zygomatic bone. Now we've got the infraorbital nerve covering the more medial portions of the cheeks, and we have the zygomaticotemporal covering a bit of the temporal and infratemporal fossae back here. So this is looking very nice for us to understand. And then we've just got to remember that it also covers the teeth. There was the posterior superior alveolar nerve, and there's two more that I'm about to tell you about. So this isn't the end of the story. I have more to say. You see, when it goes into this infraorbital canal, it's going to give off two branches whilst it's going through the infraorbital canal that are going to go down through the maxillary bone. Remember, it's moving through the top of the maxillary bone here. It's going to give off two branches whilst it's in the infraorbital canal that are going to go down through the maxillary bone, down through something called the maxillary sinuses. So these are something that we're going to come back to much, much later, and there'll be stars later on when we're discussing sinusitis. But at the moment, let me introduce them. So in the maxillary bones here, there is actually a space, a sinus, an air space, a space that is full of air. They are not solid bone. If you chiseled through this bone here, you would get into an air space there, and that is called the maxillary sinus, and you have them on both sides, and they connect up to the nasal cavities in ways that we will look at later on. But for now, know that in this space here, and in fact I might even draw it on this big picture because it's easily got room to have it put in. So in this sort of space, I'll do it in sort of dashed lines. In this space of the maxillary bone here, you have an air space, a great big cavity, one nice simple shaped cavity, almost like a cube shape in the maxillary bone. This is called the maxillary sinus, because of course it's in the maxillary bone, the sinus is a space. And as I say, it's full of air, it's connected to the nasal cavity, and the two of them, because you have one on each side, are part of the collection of sinuses called the paranasal sinuses. Okay, so let's try and just complete this picture up a bit, because we've abandoned this picture. So here comes the maxillary nerve into the orbital cavity. It will go through the infraorbital groove, then it will come into the infraorbital canal, and it will come out of the infraorbital foramen. So let's just put on a few circles. So let's say here is the infraorbital foramen, here's the entrance to the infraorbital canal. So this bit in between here is the infraorbital canal. It's running through the top of the maxillary bone. Whilst it's in here, it's going to give two branches that are going to go through the maxillary sinus here, and are going to go down to the teeth. And so let me put these on in yellow here. So here is one of them, going through the maxillary bone, and here is another one, again going through the maxillary bone, through the maxillary sinus, and they're going down to the teeth. So you can hopefully guess the names of these. These are all superior alveolar nerves because they are all innervating the superior row of teeth. There are three superior alveolar nerves, the one at the front, which is called the anterior, the one at the middle, called the middle, and the one at the back, called the posterior one. We've seen the posterior one, so we've just got to name these other two. This one here is, of course, the middle one, and then this one at the front is called the anterior superior alveolar nerve. Okay, so there we go. Let me just get rid of that mess that I've managed to make again. I really need to find some way of avoiding touching bits of the screen that I don't intend to. So, we've now completed up the anatomy of the maxillary nerve. So we've done two of the main divisions of the trigeminal nerve. Let's just summarise everything that we've seen about the maxillary nerve and say which bits, therefore, of the face it is going to carry sensory information. And of course, the bits we're most interested in is nociceptive sensory information from. So, the maxillary nerve comes through the foramen rotundum, which is here, enters this cavity or space called the pterygopalatine fossa. There, the first branch it gives off is the zygomatic nerve, which goes through the inferior orbital fissure into the orbital cavity, splits up into two branches, zygomatico-temporal branch, which comes out of the zygomatico-temporal foramen into this sort of infratemporal region and innervates structures with sensory innervation in that region. And then the zygomaticofacial nerve, which comes out of the zygomaticofacial foramen on the surface of the cheekbone, and which is the other name for the zygomatic bone, and will then innervate the skin and the muscle in this sort of region. Then the maxillary nerve gives off the posterior superior alveolar nerve, which goes down here on the side of the maxillary bone into the alveolar foramen and innervates some of the superior row of teeth. The maxillary nerve then continues on through the inferior orbital fissure into the orbital cavity, goes through the infraorbital groove into the infraorbital canal, and then whilst it's going through the infraorbital canal gives off the middle and anterior superior alveolar nerves. So we have a clear message here. The maxillary nerve innervates with sensory innervation the superior row of teeth. And of course, you have two maxillary nerves on both sides, innervating the two sides of the superior row of teeth. Then the maxillary nerve, no longer called the maxillary nerve, of course, now called the infraorbital nerve, comes out of the infraorbital foramen and then is going to innervate the medial portion of the cheek. So overall, we have seen this is going to supply sensory innervation to the cheek region, the top of the cheek region, and also the superior row of teeth. So, Summarising what we've seen about ophthalmic and maxillary nerves so far, ophthalmic nerve is the eye and its surrounding structures, the forehead and the top of the scalp. Maxillary is the superior row of teeth and the top portion of the cheek. We will have a break here. In the next video, we will complete up our anatomy of the trigeminal nerve by looking at the mandibular nerve.